The nail went straight through the carved initials his father had burned into that wood 50 years ago. A single brass nail driven clean through the letter M. Elias Mercer stood at the edge of the gravel turnout and watched it happen. He had stopped for coffee at the gas station on Route 9 before heading home, and the detour added only 4 minutes to the drive. 4 minutes that placed him exactly on the crest of the hill overlooking Blackstone Lake at the right moment to watch a woman in a white dress accept a glass of champagne from a waiter and raise it toward a crowd gathered on a freshly stained cedar deck. He didn't know her name yet. He would learn it soon enough. He stood beside his truck and drank his gas station coffee and watched the ribbon get cut. The band played something brassy and cheerful. The crowd clapped. Somebody released a handful of silver balloons that floated up into the afternoon sky and caught the light. The banner stretched between 2 new-cut timber posts at the entrance to the eastern road. It read, Silver Ridge Retreat Grand Opening. Beneath it, 139 small cabins stretched around the eastern rim of the lake in 2 curving rows, their tin roofs catching the late afternoon sun in repeating flashes. They were uniform in the way that subdivisions are uniform, each one slightly different in curtain color or porch furniture or the potted plant on the step, but identical in structure, identical in footprint, identical in their complete disregard for the topography they occupied. Some of them sat no more than 40 feet from the water line. Several sat closer. Elias could see even from a distance that the fill gravel beneath the nearest foundations had been pushed right up to the natural shoreline berm. He had seen that berm before. He had measured it. He knew exactly what it was there to contain. He stood there long enough to finish the coffee, and then he got back in the truck. He drove down the hill slowly. A young man in a polo shirt with a Silver Ridge HOA lanyard stepped into the road before Elias had fully stopped and held up one hand with the practiced authority of someone who had recently been given a new responsibility and was taking it seriously. The young man smiled the way people smile when they have been trained to smile. He said the lake was a private residential amenity and that the road beyond this point was restricted to Silver Ridge residents and their guests, and that Elias would need to turn around. Elias said he owned the lake. The young man's smile adjusted slightly but did not disappear. He said Elias would need to leave a contact form request on the HOA website. Elias looked past the young man toward the dock, toward the brass nail still glinting in the afternoon light, and then he put the truck in reverse and backed up the hill. The woman in the white dress had watched the truck come down and watched it leave. She said something to the man beside her, and they both laughed. Her name, Elias would learn, was Victoria Hale. She was the founding president of the Silver Ridge Homeowners Association, a woman who had spent 3 years assembling the investment group, acquiring the development permits, contracting the construction company, and marketing the cabins to retirement-minded buyers across 4 states. She had a talent for persuasion and a deep, unexamined confidence in the quality of her own research. She had looked at the county assessor's records and seen a body of water without a registered owner's name attached to it, and concluded that it was available. She had not pulled the underlying deed. She had not consulted a water rights attorney. She had not contacted the Army Corps of Engineers. She had looked at the map and seen an opportunity and moved forward because that was what she did, and it had always worked before. Standing there on this fresh cedar deck with champagne raised, she said to the assembled cabin owners, 1 private community, 1 private lake. 139 families standing together on the same shore building something worth having. The crowd applauded. Children ran along the new dock. Someone's dog splashed into the shallows near the swimming float. It looked like exactly what she had promised them it would look like. She had worked hard to make it look that way. On the far end of the lake, barely visible through the trees, the concrete structure of Cedar Ridge Dam sat in its clearing with its control room and its reinforced spillway gates, saying nothing, waiting for no one, indifferent to everything that had just been promised in its vicinity. Elias drove home along the old fire road that ran the western edge of the property. His house sat where it had always sat, a timber frame structure his grandfather had built in the late 1940s on a shelf of land that looked out over the water from the western shore. His father had added a kitchen wing in 1961 and a back porch in 1974. It was not a large or a fashionable house. It had a stone fireplace that drew cleanly, and a kitchen table that faced the water through a wide window, and a back porch where you could sit in the evenings and hear nothing but the tree frogs, and the herons, and the occasional night bird calling across the water. He parked in the gravel drive and sat in the truck for a moment and looked at the lake through the pines. On the far side, the jazz band was still audible, a faint brightness in the evening air. He went inside and made a pot of real coffee and stood at the kitchen window drinking it. Then he went to the hallway closet and moved 3 boxes of winter gear aside and pulled out the fireproof safe. The folder his father had left him was green, the color of old government documents, and it was held together with 2 rubber bands that had dried and cracked over the decades to the point where they were more artifact than function. Inside was a deed dated 1941, a second deed dated 1963, expanding the registered parcel to include the dam property, a federal flood easement registration filed with the Army Corps of Engineers, a state water rights certificate covering the full lake basin, a set of engineering surveys from 3 different decades, and a laminated card with the emergency release specifications for Cedar Ridge Dam printed on one side, and his father's handwriting on the other, call county first allow 48 hours. His father had built the dam in the summer of 1963, working with a hired crew from the next county over. He had built it to manage seasonal water levels and to protect the downstream watershed from the kind of uncontrolled flooding that had damaged the Low Farms twice in the decade before. The dam was on Mercer land. The easement surrounding it, the legally designated flood release zone extending 300 feet in every direction from the spillway, was registered Mercer land. The lake itself was Mercer land. Every inch of shoreline, every square foot of lake bed, every reed bed, and every beaver-cut stump along the margin. The 1941 deed was clear. The 1963 deed was clear. The federal registration was unambiguous. There was no gap in the chain of title that anyone could drive a subdivision through. Elias turned to the back of the folder. There, bound with a paperclip, were the copies. 15 letters each sent by certified mail, each signed for upon delivery. He laid them on the kitchen table in order. The first had gone out 14 months ago, the week he had driven past the eastern road and seen the yellow earth movers breaking the ridge. It was a measured and polite letter. It explained the situation in plain terms. It attached a copy of the deed, a copy of the water rights certificate, and a copy of the flood zone maps prepared by the county drainage office. It identified the specific area of concern, the low shelf on the eastern shore that fell within the 300-foot release zone, and requested that all construction cease immediately and that the developer contact him before proceeding further. He had written it at the kitchen table in the morning with his coffee beside him, and he had driven it to the post office himself. 12 days later, when construction continued, he sent a second letter. He attached the federal easement registration and the Army Corps of Engineers documentation that established the release zone's legal standing. The tone was still measured, but the language was more specific. The activity you are conducting falls within a federally registered flood release easement. Structures placed within this zone are at risk of significant damage in the event of a lawful maintenance release. You are advised to cease construction and consult with a licensed water rights attorney before proceeding. He kept sending them. Every 3 to 4 weeks, certified mail return receipt requested. He sent the 8th one with a copy of the engineering report from Samuel Briggs, the county drainage engineer, who had reviewed the site at Elias's request and confirmed in a formal written report that the planned cabin position, specifically the 87 units in the low-lying eastern section, fell directly within the designated release zone and would sustain damage in a standard maintenance release. That report had been submitted to the county, and a copy was included with the letter. He sent the 12th letter with a copy of the federal notice regulations explaining that a property owner's obligation to provide advance warning of a scheduled release was satisfied by written notification to the party responsible for structures in the easement zone. He sent the 15th letter 3 weeks before the grand opening, addressed jointly to Victoria Hale as HOA president and to the HOA's legal representative whose name appeared on the HOA's county filings. He kept all 15 return receipts. Each one bore a signature, Victoria Hale's own hand, or an authorized signature made on her behalf. He had stacked them in order and held them together with the paperclip, and he held them now in his hand at the kitchen table and looked at them in the light from the window. His father had told him once, if anyone ever questions who owns this lake, this folder answers it. They had been sitting on the dock in the early morning with fishing lines in the water, not really fishing, just sitting the way a father and a son sometimes sit together in the morning with an excuse to do so. Thomas Mercer had not said it with drama or warning. He had said it the way a man says something he does not expect to ever need, repeated a piece of information filed under unlikely but worth knowing, like the location of the circuit breaker box. He had built the dam with his own crew and registered the easement himself and filed every piece of paperwork in triplicate because he was the kind of man who understood that property was worth exactly as much as you could prove in writing and not $1 more. Elias had not thought much about the folder for most of his adult life. He had thought about it when his father died, when he had gone through the safe carefully and updated the insurance and confirmed that all the registrations were current. He thought about it now. He thought about the brass nail in the dock. He was refilling his coffee cup at the counter when he heard the sound of vehicles on the drive. He looked out the kitchen window. A black pickup truck followed closely by a silver sedan. He watched through the glass as Victoria Hale stepped out of the passenger side of the truck and looked at the house with the appraising attention of someone arriving at a negotiation she expected to control. A man in a dark suit stepped out of the sedan carrying a leather portfolio. He was perhaps 40 broad-shouldered, with the expression of someone who had been given the facts of a situation by one party and had not yet been given any reason to doubt them. He wore the confident posture of a man who had won most of the rooms he had walked into. His name was Connor Reed. He was the HOA's attorney of record. Victoria Hale stood on the porch while Connor Reed outlined the association's position in the careful language of a man who has written his argument more carefully than he has checked his sources. The association, he said, had retained rights to the lake and surrounding property through an easement acquired in conjunction with the original development purchase, a recorded county document transferring certain access and use rights to the Silver Ridge development entity. He produced the document from his portfolio and set it on the table. It was 2 pages notarized with a county record number printed across the top. The HOA was prepared to formalize the arrangement through a permanent easement agreement, he continued, that would grant the association full recreational use rights to the lake and operational oversight of Cedar Ridge Dam as community infrastructure. In the event that Elias declined to execute the agreement, the association would pursue a damages claim in the amount of $50,000 for interference with established resident access to community amenities. Victoria Hale watched Elias from across the table with the focused patience of someone who considers patience a tactic. Elias picked up the document. He read it twice. He set it down carefully. He asked Connor Reed a single question. He said, "Did you pull the actual county records for this parcel yourself, or did you work from documents provided by your client?" Connor Reed's expression shifted by approximately 3 degrees, enough to notice, not enough to call a change. He said that the supporting documentation had been provided by the association and that he had reviewed it thoroughly. Elias nodded once. He opened the green folder and placed his deed on the table next to Connor Reed's amendment. He placed the federal easement registration beside the deed. He placed the Army Corps of Engineers correspondence and the state water rights certificate in a row across the table. He sat back and said nothing and let the attorney read. Connor Reed picked up the deed first. Then he picked up the federal registration. His eyes moved back and forth between the county record number printed on the HOA amendment and the record numbers on the original documents. They were not the same. They were not close to the same. One of them matched county records. Connor Reed knew from the way records numbers worked which one. Victoria Hale said she was prepared to purchase the property outright at a fair market assessment, and she named a number. The number was less than a quarter of what a timber company had offered Elias 8 years prior, which he had declined because the lake was not a transaction he was interested in having with anyone. He said no. She said he was being unreasonable and obstructive. He said he had sent 15 letters over 14 months, and she had signed for every one of them. She said the letters were frivolous and alarmist and that her legal counsel had evaluated them. Connor Reed, at this point in the conversation, was looking at the federal easement registration with an expression that had traveled a significant distance from where it had started. Victoria said she had 139 families behind her and resources sufficient to pursue this matter through every available court. Elias said she was welcome to do that. He walked them to the door. He was washing his coffee cup when the knock came. It was not the knock of someone who was certain they wanted to knock. He opened the door, and a woman stood on the porch in the evening air, perhaps 60 years old, wearing a Silver Ridge lanyard and a jacket that was not quite warm enough for the temperature. She introduced herself as Claire Bennett. She said she owned Cabin 42. She said she had seen him at the grand opening, and she had been sitting near the back of the HOA meeting that evening when she overheard parts of the conversation between Victoria Hale and the board members afterward, and there was something in the way the words were chosen that had made her uneasy in the specific way that someone who has spent a career in administration becomes uneasy when language is deployed to avoid rather than convey. She said she needed to understand what was actually happening. Elias held the door open. She had paid $280,000 for Cabin 42. She had saved for 11 years carefully, the way someone saves when they have a specific goal and no margin for detours. She was recently retired from 23 years as a school district administrator, and the cabin was the plan. Not an approximation of the plan, not a version of it, but the actual specific plan for what her retirement would look like. Morning coffee on the porch with the water in front of her. Afternoons with a book. Winters somewhere warmer, springs back at the lake. She had no other real estate. She had no inheritance arriving. The $280,000 was most of what she had, and she had read all the HOA documents given to her at closing, including a one-page easement disclosure that had used the word easement in a way that suggested ordinary utility access rather than anything involving water levels. And she had signed because the notary was there and the attorney said everything was in order and she had no reason to believe otherwise. Elias spread the flood zone maps on the kitchen table. He laid the engineering survey alongside them and weighted the corners with his coffee cup and a jar from the counter. He pointed to Cedar Ridge Dam at the southern end of the lake. He traced the release zone boundary with the tip of one finger, a curve that swept outward from the spillway in a 300-foot radius and enclosed, depending on precise foundation position, between 84 and 89 of the 139 cabins. He showed her where Cabin 42 appeared on the map. It sat on the upper rim comfortably above the floodline. That was not the point of showing her. The point was the 60 or so cabins below it, the ones whose positions fell inside the boundary, the ones whose fill gravel had been pushed to the shoreline, and whose foundations sat on the natural flood shelf as though the shelf were stable ground rather than a safety mechanism. Claire asked him to say it plainly. He said, in the event of a lawful maintenance release from Cedar Ridge Dam, water levels in the eastern basin will rise by approximately 4 to 6 feet within 90 minutes of gate opening. Structures within the release zone that are not constructed to flood elevation standards, and none of these will sustain significant structural damage. Some will be displaced from their foundations entirely. She looked at the map for a time. She asked whether he had told anyone. He said he had told the HOA in writing 15 times over 14 months with documentation, including the county drainage engineer's official report, the federal easement registration, the Army Corps of Engineers correspondence, and the engineering surveys. He said that Samuel Briggs, the county drainage engineer, had personally visited the site and submitted a formal finding to the county confirming the risk. He said that report had been forwarded to the HOA by the county office and that he had enclosed a copy in the 9th letter he sent and that Victoria Hale had signed for it. He said he had received no substantive response to any communication. Claire sat with that for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, across the dark water, a cabin light was visible through the pines. She asked what he was going to do. He told her he had filed a public maintenance release notice with the county the previous week. The dam required a scheduled release to clear sediment accumulation from the spillway channel, a procedure performed every 18 to 24 months and mandated by the federal easement terms. The notice period, required by both the county and the federal registration, was 6 days. The notice had been filed. The release was scheduled for the following Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. He had notified the county sheriff's office and the state emergency management division. He had done everything required of him. The only intervention that could prevent damage to the cabins in the release zone was voluntary evacuation, and that was not something he had authority to compel. He could give notice. He had given notice. He had been giving notice for over a year. Claire left at 10:30. Elias stood on the back porch and listened to the lake for a while before going inside. 2 mornings later, he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and a laptop and reviewed the security footage from the camera above the dam access gate. The footage from 48 hours before showed a silver sedan arriving at 11:47 in the evening. 3 figures approached the gate. The first used bolt cutters on the padlock. The second figure was Victoria Hale, identifiable by her white coat, and the particular way she stood with her weight on one foot. The third was a younger man carrying a phone held horizontally, filming everything with the comfortable confidence of someone who does not consider being filmed a risk. They walked to the dam control room, cut the second padlock, and went inside. They spent 22 minutes there. On the way out, the younger man fixed a printed placard to the control room door. Elias pulled on his boots and walked down to the dam in the morning air and read it. HOA infrastructure authorized personnel only. He photographed the placard, the cut padlocks, and the door from multiple angles. He drove to the courthouse and filed a criminal trespass complaint with supporting documentation, including the time-stamped footage. He called his attorney. He filed an expedited hearing request with the county water court regarding unauthorized interference with a federally registered dam structure. He replaced the padlocks with heavier ones and ran a second chain through the gate before driving home. He did not call Victoria Hale. He did not write another letter. He made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table and looked at the lake through the window. The HOA filed their emergency motion 2 days before the scheduled hearing. They sought a court order transferring operational control of Cedar Ridge Dam to the Homeowners Association on the basis that it constituted critical infrastructure serving the Silver Ridge residential community. The motion referenced the amended easement document Connor Reed had produced at Elias's kitchen table and cited its county record number as the legal foundation of the association's claim. The filing was polished. It was confident. It had been prepared by someone who had not yet verified the record number against the actual county archives. The hearing room held perhaps 50 people when full. It was full. Victoria Hale arrived with Connor Reed and 3 board members, all of them in business attire, all of them projecting the organized energy of people who had rehearsed this morning and expected it to go a certain way. They took their seats at the petitioner's table with the settled comfort of people who have won enough proceedings to feel comfortable in a hearing room. Several cabin owners sat in the gallery, watching with the particular silent attention of people whose money is at stake and who do not yet know how to read the room. A reporter from the county paper sat in the back corner with a notebook. Claire Bennett sat in the second-to-last row with her own notepad and a copy of the flood map. Samuel Briggs sat beside her with his county engineering folder closed on his lap and his hands folded on top of it. The judge was a woman named Patricia Holt, 11 years on the water court bench. With the particular focused attention of someone who has learned over time that the most important thing in any hearing is what the documents actually say, not what the parties say, the documents say. Connor Reed presented the amendment. He laid out the association's position methodically and with some skill, citing the record number describing the notarized signature invoking the good faith reliance of 139 families who had purchased homes in the ordinary course of a legitimate real estate transaction in full confidence that their documentation was sound. He spoke about community investment, about the economic significance of the development to the county tax base, about the reasonable expectations of ordinary buyers who relied on the representations made at closing. It was a professional performance. He was 3 paragraphs in, well into his stride, when Judge Holt quietly raised one hand and asked the clerk to pull the county record corresponding to the document number cited in the HOA's amendment. The clerk submitted the electronic request. The result came back in under 2 minutes. The judge looked at the document on her terminal screen. She read it once, and then she read it again. Then she asked Connor Reed to confirm, for the official record, the document number cited in the amendment he had submitted. He confirmed it. She turned her screen so the court's recording camera could capture the document clearly and read the relevant identifying information into the record. The document was a deed of sale dated 1987 for an agricultural parcel located 12 miles northeast of Blackstone Lake, transferring a grain storage facility and the surrounding acreage from the Donovan family to a rural grain cooperative. It contained no reference to any lake. It contained no reference to any easement. It contained no reference to any dam, any water body, any shoreline, or any property within 30 miles of where they were currently sitting. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when a single fact rearranges everything everyone in them thought they understood. Not the loud silence of shock, but the deeper, slower quiet of recalibration of people looking at each other, and then at the floor, and then at nothing in particular while they work out what they now know. Elias laid the 1941 deed on the table. He laid the 1963 expansion deed beside it. He laid the federal easement registration, the Army Corps correspondence, the state water rights certificate, and Samuel Briggs's county engineering report in a row. Samuel Briggs was called to the stand and testified that he had personally inspected the Silver Ridge construction site, had submitted a formal finding to the county confirming that the eastern development fell within the release zone, that this finding had been forwarded to the HOA by the county drainage office, and that he had received no response. He testified that he had also been present at the site on 3 subsequent occasions and that construction had continued uninterrupted throughout the notification period. The judge asked Connor Reed whether he had at any point reviewed the certified mail records showing receipt of the 15 letters. He said he had not reviewed them personally. She asked whether he had been made aware that his client had received 15 certified warnings over 14 months before the HOA filed its motion. He said he had not been made aware of that. Victoria Hale sat beside him looking at the surface of the table. Judge Holt ruled from the bench without taking the matter under advisement, which is what judges do when they consider the outcome clear. The HOA's motion was denied. The trespass complaint would proceed on a separate docket. The court would not enjoin a lawful maintenance release on federally registered infrastructure. She said it without theater or elaboration. The court will not stop a lawful release. That was all. On the courthouse steps in front of a small cluster of reporters who had been tipped off about the hearing, Victoria Hale said there would be no release. She said the community was prepared to exhaust every avenue of legal remedy available. She said the ruling was preliminary. She said 139 families stood behind her. The reporters wrote it down. Elias went home and posted the evacuation advisory to the county public notice board. Claire had already begun going door to door along the eastern rim that morning, carrying the flood map on her phone and stopping at each cabin to explain what she had learned and what it meant. Some people listened. An older couple in cabin 17 thanked her and began moving their things to their car within the hour. A man in cabin 53 told her through a half-open door that she was being used in somebody else's property dispute and closed the door. A family in cabin 91 listened to everything she said and then asked if there was anything in writing from the county, and she showed them the engineering report on her phone, and the father looked at it for a long time and went inside to talk to his wife. Victoria Hale sent a community-wide message to all cabin owners that afternoon explaining that the legal situation was resolved in the association's favor and that the weekend's plans should proceed as normal. She had already been in contact with the rental management company, which booked the remaining open cabins at a 20% discount to ensure full occupancy for the weekend. Philip Osgood, who was the HOA treasurer and who had been sitting in on board meetings and taking official minutes for 2 years, read the afternoon message and then opened his laptop and began writing a different kind of document. He wrote carefully, citing dates, citing votes, citing record numbers. He saved multiple copies. By Friday evening, the access road was busy with arriving guests who had no idea what had been argued in a county courthouse that week. They came with coolers and weekend bags and kayaks on roof racks and children who pressed their faces to car windows to look at the lake. They parked and carried their things inside and opened the curtains on the water view and felt exactly what Victoria Hale had promised them they would feel, which was the specific satisfaction of having made a good decision. Claire watched them arrive from her porch. She had spent the day going to every cabin she had not yet reached, knocking on every door, and she had found a range of responses that tracked more or less with how much each person had already committed to believing the weekend would be fine. Some people thanked her and started packing. Some people told her they had received the HOA's assurance email and were choosing to trust it. One man said he had spoken to his attorney and was confident the situation was under legal control. He seemed to mean this sincerely. Claire helped an elderly woman named Ruth who had cabin 7 and who had bought it 18 months ago for a retirement that had not yet fully begun to pack her medications and her documents and her cat into her sedan that evening. Ruth moved slowly and asked careful questions, and Claire answered each one while helping fold sweaters and locate the cat's carrier under the bed. Ruth's son was already on the road from 3 hours away. Claire followed the sedan to the main road intersection in her own car to make sure Ruth knew the turning, and then she drove back alone in the dark. She sat in her cabin for a while in the quiet. The jazz music was long gone. Through the window, the lake was very still and black. The cabin lights of the occupied units reflected on the surface in soft, broken lines. She thought about the 87 families who had not left. She thought about the county engineering report and the 15 letters and the signed return receipts. She did not sleep much before morning. Saturday arrived clear and cold, with that particular mountain morning quality where the air feels like it has been rinsed clean overnight and everything has a slightly harder edge than usual, the tree lines sharper, the water darker, the distances more precise. Elias walked the dam at 7. He checked the mechanisms with the methodical attention of someone who has been responsible for a piece of infrastructure long enough to know what right feels like and what slightly off feels like. He checked the gate seals and the gauge readings and walked the length of the spillway channel looking at the water moving through the lower section. Everything was as it should be. He had serviced the gates 2 weeks prior, working through the maintenance checklist in the order his father had established, the same order it had always been done. He had notified the county at 6 that morning that the release would proceed as scheduled. The sheriff had a unit at the main road. The State Emergency Management Office had logged the notification. He walked back up to the house, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with it until 8:45, looking at the water through the kitchen window the way his father used to look at it. Then he put on his jacket and walked back down. At 8:59, Elias Mercer stood at the control panel of Cedar Ridge Dam in the cold morning air. The lake was perfectly still. Through the trees on the far side, he could see the shapes of cabins' porch lights on chimney smoke rising from a few of the units that had the small wood stoves. People were out there making coffee, watching the morning, believing in the solidity of the ground under them. He thought about his father standing in the same place, looking at the same water in the summer of 1963, when the concrete was new and the registration papers were fresh. He thought about the green folder and the dried rubber bands. He thought about 15 signed return receipts. He looked at the release gauge and then at the clock on the panel face. He placed his hand on the lever. He pulled it. The spillway opened at the exact specifications mandated by the federal easement terms, a controlled graduated release opening in 2 stages with a 40-minute interval precisely as the protocol document described and precisely as the laminated card in his father's handwriting specified. The water level in the eastern basin began to rise at the predicted rate. At 9:14, the first cabin, one of the front row units in the lowest lying section, a unit that sat 41 feet from the shoreline with its rear foundation resting on the natural berm, began to shift. The movement was initially almost imperceptible, a slow settling toward the water, and then the fill gravel beneath the rear corner gave way and the structure lifted at the back and tilted. Its walls separated at the seams. Its contents, a couch, a kitchen table, a child's plastic bin of beach toys, spread into the water in a slow fan and began moving with the current. Victoria Hale's son had been on the upper deck of the HOA clubhouse since early morning with his phone pointed at the lake, filming. He had been doing this since his mother had told him the morning would be uneventful, which had struck him as worth documenting either way. He pointed the camera at the first cabin as it shifted. The second cabin behind it began to move. He watched through the screen. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Ooh." The sound changed by 9:30 from birdsong and wind to engines and voices. Residents who had stayed waded through water that was in most areas between 1 and 3 feet deep cold, disorienting, frightening, but not life-threatening. The spillway specifications had been calculated for exactly this maximum easement volume, minimum downstream risk-controlled rate of rise. A Range Rover belonging to one of the board members stalled in the water near the main road and had to be pushed to the shoulder. Victoria Hale stood at the edge of the parking area, water around her ankles, explaining to a county deputy in a loud voice that this was an illegal act, that she had court filings, that someone was going to be held responsible. The deputy wrote things on a notepad and did not particularly hurry. 87 cabins sustained damage, 14 were displaced from their foundations, 23 were structurally compromised and uninhabitable pending assessment. The 52 cabins in the safe zone above the release boundary were untouched. The ambulance that had staged at the bottom of the hill at the request of the County Emergency Management Office drove away at 11 with no passengers. Philip Osgood emailed the meeting minutes to Elias's attorney at 2 in the afternoon. The minutes covered 26 months of board meetings and contained in the careful, dry language of official documentation a complete record receipt of each of the 15 letters, board discussion of each letter's contents, legal counsel's verbal assessment in which Connor Reed had characterized the warnings as, in his professional opinion, likely non-credible given the absence of any registered ownership marker visible in the county's digital mapping system, a system which Elias's attorney would later note had not been updated since 2011 and did not reflect the 1963 Deed Amendment. The minutes also contained the vote 3-2 to disregard the warnings and proceed with the original development timeline. Both dissenting votes were recorded without comment. The lawsuits began before the water had finished receding from the lowest cabins. Owners of damaged properties filed against the HOA within the first week. 11 filed personal claims against Victoria Hale citing misrepresentation at the point of sale and the fraudulent county record number used in the easement documentation provided at closing. The development's insurance carrier reviewed the claims, the flood zone maps, the engineering report, the 15 certified letters, and the meeting minutes. They declined coverage under the known risk exclusion written into the policy. The exclusion had been in the policy language since the original filing. Nobody had read it carefully. Connor Reed submitted a voluntary disclosure to the State Bar Association before the Bar Association's own inquiry reached him. The disclosure stated that he had relied on client-provided documentation without independently verifying the county records, and that he now had reason to believe those documents had been altered. The Bar Association opened a formal investigation. Victoria Hale's personal assets were frozen pending the civil proceedings. The second development project she had funded with the Silver Ridge proceeds was suspended. Her attorney, a different attorney, someone who had done this kind of work before, told her that her exposure in the class action exceeded $12 million and that the number was not fixed. Claire organized the plaintiff group. She held the first meeting in the undamaged clubhouse building above the flood line, and 48 people came. She had spent the preceding week driving to county offices and pulling the real records herself, the ones that matched Elias's deed, the ones that bore the correct record numbers, the ones that showed what had always been true. She laid them on the clubhouse tables alongside copies of the forged amendment and the meeting minutes and the certified mail returns. She walked people through the documents the way she had once walked school boards through budget shortfalls, patiently, without condescension, with the belief that people can understand a situation when it is placed in front of them honestly. Some people were angry at Elias. More of them, after reading the documents and hearing the timeline, were angry at Victoria Hale. All of them were frightened about what came next. Claire said she would help them figure that out. She meant it. The vote to dissolve the Silver Ridge Homeowners Association was held 6 weeks after the release. All 139 ballots were issued. The dissolution passed by a margin that surprised no one who had read the meeting minutes and understood the arithmetic of how much each family had lost and why and at whose direction. Elias gave the board's formal notification of dissolution to his attorney without comment. The association that had nailed a sign into his father's dock, that had cut the padlocks on a federally registered dam, and posted a placard on the control room door, that had filed a court motion based on a deed number belonging to a grain cooperative in the next county. That association now existed only on paper, in the past tense, in a county file that would be archived and eventually scanned and stored on a server somewhere and never looked at again. Elias drove to the dam on a Tuesday morning in late October. The air smelled like cold pine and damp earth. The lake had returned to its ordinary color, the dark gray-green of early autumn, without the churned clay tint the release had given it in the days after. He had tools in the truck bed and the HOA's placard in a garbage bag. He unbolted the placard from the control room door and set it in the truck. He walked the dam one more time, checking the gate seals, making sure the reset procedure he'd completed 2 weeks prior had held. He checked each mechanism twice, the way his father had taught him, once for the reading, once for the feel. Everything was as it should be. The lake behind the spillway was full to its normal autumn-level dark and still in the pine-shadowed morning. He walked down to the dock. The dock was the original structure, his grandfather's framing and his father's additions repaired and maintained over the decades, so that it was neither the old dock nor a new one, but something that had continued. He worked slowly with a pry bar, removing the HOA sign from the planks without splitting the wood. Beneath it, where the sign had covered the surface, the wood was darker, protected from years of weathering by the thing that had been nailed over it. The carved initials were intact. He had looked at them in the weeks since, and thought about the brass nail, and thought about what his father would have made of all of this, and he had concluded, knowing the man, that his father would not have been surprised by any of it. His father had built the dam and filed the easement and kept the folder because he understood that the world was full of people who looked at a body of water and decided it was available. He cleaned the wood with a rag and worked linseed oil into the grain with slow strokes, the way his father had taught him to treat exposed timber. Then he brought out the small piece of cedar he had cut and shaped 2 evenings before and fitted it into the slot he had prepared below the original initials. He had carved 2 letters into it, E.M., not deep about the same depth as the letters above, made with the same tool in the same hand. He fastened it carefully and sat back on his heels and looked at it. The dock, the initials, the lake behind them, things that continued. The morning light came from the east across the open water flat and silver, moving in small patches where the wind touched the surface. Claire came down the path from the cabin road with 2 cups of coffee, picking her way over the exposed roots carefully, and she handed one to Elias without a word and stood beside him looking out at the water. Her cabin number 42 on the upper rim well above the flood line had not been touched. She had spent weeks going through county records and easement maps with the methodical attention she had once brought to school budget audits, and she had marked every boundary and filed copies with 3 different offices because she had learned the hard way what it costs when you assume someone else has done that work. In the distance, on the surviving cabins above the release line, porch lights were coming on as the morning got going. The reflections sat on the water in soft yellow columns, steady and warm. There were ducks near the far shore, moving along in a slow diagonal line, the way ducks do when nothing is bothering them. Elias held the coffee cup in both hands. The lake was quiet. The frogs were still going in the reed beds. A heron stood motionless in the shallows to the south, absolutely still, watching the water with the long patience of a creature that has no expectation of anything changing quickly. Victoria Hale had believed that 139 families could outvote ownership. She had believed that organizational confidence was a form of due diligence, that a notarized signature on a document with a false record number was as good as the record it claimed to reference, that a man who kept sending certified letters was a man who could be outlasted. She had believed that scale was the same as rightness, that enough people standing on a shore together made the shore theirs. But lakes do not negotiate with associations. Water does not recognize quorum. The release zone was not a legal position to be argued. It was a physical reality baked into the land's topography by geology and enforced by gravity. The dam existed because the land required it. The easement existed because physics required it. The folder existed because Thomas Mercer had understood both of those things in 1963 and had written them down in triplicate and registered them with the federal government because he knew that the world would eventually produce someone who would look at his lake and decide it was available. Elias set the empty cup on the dock railing. He looked at his father's initials and his own below them, and at the water beyond, and at the morning light coming across it in small, bright movements. The heron did not move. The ducks continued along the far shore. The water was what it had always been, cold, indifferent, exact, flowing by the only rule it had ever followed. Claire stood beside him, saying nothing because nothing needed saying. The lake was quiet. It had been quiet before all of this. It would be quiet long after.